Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 10 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. A couple of months ago, while I was reading my weekend paper, I noticed 3 stories about electric vehicles in that same edition. EVs, like Elon Musk, used to get nothing but fawning media coverage, but all 3 of those stories I was reading that Saturday morning had a far more critical slant on their coverage. And after comparing notes inside and outside of Energy versus Climate, we as a group realized that these stories might just be part of a trend. Now, car models and car companies going from media darlings to media pariahs is nothing unprecedented, nor is it earth-shattering, but it did give us pause for thought on the topic of EVs generally and the role they play within climate mitigation, which is something that we've not covered in depth as a specific topic on Energy versus Climate before. And that ends today. So today we're going to debate the role of EVs overall in climate mitigation. I do want to note off the top something we all agree on, and quoting the International Panel on Climate Change in its 6th assessment report in 2023, it said in its chapter on transport the following: widespread electrification of the transport sector is likely crucial for reducing transport emissions, and it depends on appropriate electrical energy storage systems. So that we agree on the likely crucial role of electrification of transport, including EVs and passenger vehicles, for decarbonizing our economies. And by the way, we'll provide a link to that report in the show notes. So we've got a very special guest to help us with this discussion. Simon Evans is Deputy Editor and Policy Editor at Carbon Brief, which is a UK-based website covering the latest developments in climate science, energy policy, and climate policy. He covers those policy topics and holds a PhD in biochemistry from Bristol University. And in 2022, Simon won the Energy and Environment category at the Press Gazette's British Journalism Awards. And today he's joining us from East London in England. Welcome, Simon.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Now, for today's show, we're going to start with a quick primer on fact versus fiction to do with EVs with Simon, including some of that recent and negative media coverage that we've been noticing. Then I will guide us through some questions more to do with the role of EVs in approaches to climate policy generally, till about 40 to 45 minutes after the hour, and then we'll have our usual 15-minute Q&A. Feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and thanks for not using the raise hand function or chat box. So, Simon, let's get to it. Has the volume of negative stories, media stories about electric vehicles increased in the past 6 months, or is it just us? Does it just seem that way? And I think that everyone from notably Mr. Bean, Rowan Atkinson in your country to prominent Canadian columnists are getting in on it. And if yes, are there any objective measures of that?
We don't have objective, quantitative information on the volume of kind of negative media coverage around electric vehicles specifically. But what I will say is that at Carbon Brief, one of the things that we do every day is that we're tracking media coverage relating to energy and climate change very closely, particularly with a focus on the UK, but also internationally. Qualitatively, I guess you would say we've really noticed a big increase in the number of negative stories. I mean, thinking back a few years, I remember, back in like maybe 2017 or even earlier, there were, occasional scare stories about electric vehicles and what it would mean for the UK. The electricity grid won't cope. There aren't enough charging points. Some of the kind of classic kind of myths around electric vehicles. But I think that they were quite few and far between. And it's now that, the case that it's just relentless. I mean, so this is why last year we published this Mythbuster taking on 2021 of the most common myths about electric vehicles. And to be honest, since then, the volume has just kept going. One thing I will say, just from a UK perspective, is that we have got some quantitative information about newspaper editorials. So that's where the newspapers editorial line is being set out. And we saw over the last decade, there was a dramatic reduction in the kind of overtly climate skeptical newspaper editorials in the UK. But over the past 12 months, we've seen a massive increase in the number of kind of editorials opposing specific climate solutions. So it's really been a shift from that kind of generalized climate skepticism towards kind of challenging renewables, challenging, electric vehicles and other ways of tackling climate change.
Yeah, and I would hazard to guess that we're seeing something similar here in the North American press. But is this some of what you're seeing? Is it a case of misinformation? It's just bad reporting, getting facts wrong, or at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist? Do you think there's some active disinformation campaign work at play?
To be honest, I think a lot of it is just misinformation. Um, what one of the ones we might come on to is just this idea about, the growth in the sale of EVs slowing down, and that's get misconstrued as, actual sales are slowing down. So, instead of growing at 50% a year, it's maybe growing 30% a year, and people get confused and think that means we're selling less EVs. I mean, we're still selling a lot more EVs, just not growing quite as quickly. I guess the other thing that's worth saying is that um, the way that newspapers work does not necessarily involve, kind of people imagine like Rupert Murdoch, who owns a lot of media companies in the UK and across the world, kind of issuing an edict and saying, guys, I want lots of negative stories about EVs, and that really isn't how it works. Effectively owners and editors will make it be known indirectly often. So, a journalist might pitch a story that they want to write, and then the editor's like, nah, don't fancy that. And then over time, they kind of form an idea about what their editor's going to say yes to, and that shapes obviously the coverage that the paper puts out. So I don't know if there's active disinformation campaigns. Like, I'm sure that there's lots of lobbying that goes on behind the scenes in terms of, car companies, oil companies, and so on. But whether that really has a big impact on shaping that kind of media narrative, I'm not so sure.
Now, misinformation spreads often because it has a hint of truth, and I know you've got a theory around that. I'd love for you to get to. Let's start that there are some valid concerns about EVs, and I'd say at the top of the list would be high upfront capital cost and limited availability of EV infrastructure, although that infrastructure is increasing rapidly. But let's go through in a rapid fire way some of the other ones that you and Carbon Brief have taken on. And the one maybe starting it is lifetime costs. And this is all relative, by the way. The comparator is an internal combustion engine vehicle. So the lifetime cost with that high upfront capital cost, even with your energy savings and buying electricity versus transport fuel, it's still going to cost you more over the lifetime of a vehicle. And you say?
Yeah, that's not the case. The lifetime costs are much lower with EVs because the running costs are so much lower. That's just because EVs are so much more efficient than internal combustion engine cars. So even though electricity per unit of energy might be expensive, the running costs across a year are much lower. And that's the case whether you're, in North America, in Europe, lots of different countries with different kind of mixes of fuel taxes and electricity taxes and so on. The other thing to say is, that those upfront costs are coming down quickly. We're starting to see huge uptick in exports from China of much cheaper EVs, even though, legacy automakers in places like North America have kind of prioritized high-end EVs as their way into the market. We've got companies like BYD coming out of China with, much cheaper models. So I think that calculus, even on the upfront costs, is going to change quite quickly.
Yeah, and I know many consumers who are sitting on the sidelines waiting for Chinese VVs to start hitting the market and for the universal charger rule to take effect, which I think in Canada is next year. Okay, myth number two, or debatable in our rapid fire round, life cycle impacts. And let's talk about GHG emissions and versus taking your existing internal combustion engine and just driving it through to end of life.
This is very clear cut. You mentioned the IPCC's assessment from 2023, I think it was. Basically, they found that, assuming you don't have like a completely coal dominated grid, you're going to see significant life cycle emission savings. And, people imagine somewhere like China has a coal dependent grid, and therefore maybe driving an EV isn't a good idea there. But actually, even in China, there's something like 60% coal. So even there, you're seeing something like a 40% reduction in emissions over the course of your life cycle. Yeah, this is comparing like a new EV versus a new combustion engine car. And again, this just comes down to the efficiency, and you have to also think about the fact that the grid is getting cleaner over time as we build out renewables and other low carbon sources of electricity. I mean, I think that there's kind of three key issues that people kind of stumble over, and that makes it seem like combustion engine cars aren't as bad in terms of emissions. Firstly, they tend to ignore the fact that, when you buy a car and it says this car does whatever, like 50 miles to the gallon or whatever it says on the sticker, the real world results show that that actually is generally not very accurate. So you're looking at like 25 or even 40% higher emissions per mile. Then the second thing is people tend to ignore the fact that actually refining fuel creates lots of emissions as well. And the third thing is people tend to overstate the emissions associated with manufacturing batteries, which obviously is a relatively new technology and it's getting more efficient and cheaper over time, and that comes with lower emissions. And when you put all of those things together, then that's why you see 50 or 60% savings in greenhouse gas emissions, including the whole life cycle.
I'm glad you mentioned batteries because they often get singled out for criticism, and it seems especially of late. And the criticism being issues around the environmental and social impacts of beginning of life, so the mining that affects rural and often indigenous communities, and end of life, that is disposing of the batteries. How did you do that? So what did you and Carbon Brief say about that?
Just to start off, like we obviously can't ignore, and it's important to take into account and try and address the environmental social impacts of mining, which are significant. And it is the case that there will need to be a significant increase in mining in order to satisfy the needs for critical minerals for making batteries and other clean technologies. That said, I think people need a bit of perspective. So I think, at the moment we're extracting and burning every single year like something like 15 billion tons of fossil fuels. That's a sort of unimaginably large amount of material that we're pulling out of the ground to feed our kind of fossil fuel habit, if you like. And that's something, you need to put fuel into your car every single week. It's like an ongoing flow of fossil fuels going through the system. With electric vehicles and other clean technologies, you're mining critical minerals, you're building a battery, and then you run the battery with electricity, and that can be clean electricity. And so it's a totally different, it's a stock of batteries, if you like, and a stock of electric vehicles, and that's quite a different impact. And in terms of like looking ahead, if we get on a kind of climate kind of safe pathway, you might be talking about 30 million tons of critical minerals needing to be mined in 2030. And that's just like hundreds of times lower, just in terms of the weight. So without wanting to kind of dismiss the impacts associated with mining all of that material, I think people do need some perspective.
And last one, and then we'll get to our group discussion. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in a grid. You mentioned China's grid. Alberta still has a fairly, where two of us are sitting today, a fairly carbon-intensive grid at 450 grams for CO2 per kilowatt hour. You said by email that the latest real-world data recently published by the European Commission confirms plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are garbage when it comes to cutting carbon. So just briefly, why is that? Why wouldn't it be a good choice in a place like Alberta?
One of the ideas is, people are worried about range, they're worried about charging infrastructure. And so people are like, well, why don't we just kind of, ease into things, buy a plug-in hybrid. That means you can charge it with electricity, but also if you run out of range, if you find that you're somewhere and there isn't a plug to plug into, you can just run it on the combustion engine and keep going. And then you don't have any of those sort of kind of range anxiety concerns. The issue is that just because you can plug it in, and just because on paper, if you did plug it in all the time, you would have quite significant reductions in the emissions associated with running that vehicle, doesn't mean that people in reality actually do plug it in. So what the data you referred to from the European Commission found is that the kind of on paper savings are basically something like three times. In reality, it's something like 3.5 times worse than the on-paper savings of plug-in hybrids, simply because people just don't plug it in, because they don't have to. Obviously, with an electric vehicle, you have to plug it in when you want to charge it, but with plug-ins, you can run it on gas if you want.
Now, David and Sarah, so we agree with the IPCC statement that EVs are likely crucial, and that was the quote they used, likely crucial for tackling transport emissions. It's happening. EV sales are growing. And when we compare the cost effectiveness of policies to incentivize EVs, say, to other measures, it's difficult to calculate that when technologies are changing rapidly. But with those as caveats, and David, let me crack open the near-term cost effectiveness discussion. So by one measure, by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and we can go and provide a link to their study, and you can look at it for yourself, listener and judge, that the combination of federal and provincial rebates represents a very high cost per ton. This is the rebates for EVs, and on the order of $355 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions in Alberta. That's $964 per ton in Quebec. And given the high capital cost of EVs, these subsidies at high cost per ton bases tend to benefit high income earners more than anyone else. So that's the kind of nameplate criticism. David, can you talk about some of the ranges of costs and cost effectiveness of comparing EVs to other options, say various low carbon fuels, pathways or walkability or cycling or even public transit?
Yeah, I can try. It's very hard. I want to maybe start by saying like what it means to calculate cost effectiveness. So first you have to calculate the life cycle cost of owning some EVs. Say for 10 years, that means both the capital cost and the real cost of money that you as a consumer have to pay compared to other costs of money, and then the operating costs, which are going to be lower in the gasoline car. So that's a kind of levelized cost you need to calculate. Then you need to calculate the same levelized cost using the same methods and same cost of capital and so on for a gasoline car. And then you have to find cars that are comparable, which turns out to be very hard with the same amenities and other properties. And I've tried to do this with students in different ways, like engineering students in careful ways. It's not easy to actually find comparables, and the comparability really matters when you're trying to calculate the cost difference. So that overall is going to tell you the cost levelized cost difference of the two vehicles. So if you have the levelized cost difference, then the other thing you need is the levelized or the average difference in carbon intensity. And that there's no question, just as Simon said, that in really any situation, all but a few bizarre situations, EVs have substantially lower emissions, but calculating that emission delta also isn't actually easy to do accurately, and it's very location dependent. It depends on the grid carbon intensity, but it's more than just the average grid carbon intensity. It depends on the typical charging profile by time of day or week of the vehicles compared to the grid carbon intensity, which varies with time. So in practice, to do this right, you got to do all those things. And that's why, I mean, even if everybody was, if there was no bias, if there were no axes being ground, if you were just trying to do this in a objective way, you'd find that there was a big scatter in estimates of these costs. I've tried to do it a couple times with strong students and got big ranges, up to many, many hundreds of dollars a ton carbon. I think in some cases that's correct. And other places going to be much lower. It's very hard to know. And so I think my point there is it's actually quite hard to calculate even without these strong opinions. My impression is that in many places, it's many hundreds of dollars a ton still. That's sort of what I've got with my own calculations for the vehicle I bought. Then there's a whole separate question. A rigid econ would say that you should never pay $250 to abate a ton of carbon if you can some other place in the economy pay $200 a ton carbon. And to be clear, Ed, I'm actually not thinking about alternative fuels. I think for light duty vehicles, electrics are going to take it. And there's all sorts of reasons to believe that's going to be true in the long run. But in the long run, as economists also say, we're all dead. And so the short run does matter in thinking about how we allocate our money for carbon. But it still might be right that in some situations it is worth either individuals paying more or society paying more in order to drive induced technological change. And that was the whole point of the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, for example, was exactly structured in that way. So it may sometimes be right to pay more when you know you're inducing technological change, but it's not as if you know exactly how technological change will work. And that argument can't say that in every case you should pay for very expensive things. So that's a big, complicated way to say, A, I don't know, B, it's legitimate to ask the question. It's not just anti-EVism. There are places where the EV cost effectiveness is going to be relatively low compared to other things we can do in the economy. And it is true that those subsidies often go more to wealthy people now. Of course, that's not going to be true in the future. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think there really are issues here, even though I'm personally really excited by my EV and really do think that a bunch of concerns we had, say, about cobalt and batteries are just going away incredibly fast. And I think that we will end up with very deep EV penetration.
And David, thanks for that. I want to get all of us later just to talk about Canada's specific approach and to incentivizing EVs and EV production. And if that's, on the latter case, the right industrial policy. Sara, what is your take on this? And also, what do the numbers tell you when you looked at an EV purchase?
Sure. So when I think about the benefits, I think one of the things that, that study you cited, Ed, and many others don't pay enough attention to, or in that case, don't pay any attention to, are the non-climate benefits. And those are actually quite significant, and they impact marginalized socioeconomic groups most strongly. And so there was a recent paper by Dr. Hatsopoulou, apologies for probably butchering that name, looking at the benefits of electrification of cars and SUVs in the Greater Toronto area. And there they found that the per vehicle social benefits were somewhere around $9,850. So, David's point is well taken that, you probably could do that analysis in different ways and find somewhat different numbers. But the general scope of it, or the general size of it, I think gives some kind of indication when we compare that to, a $5,000 federal benefit. And the reason for that, a piece of that is the carbon benefits, but a very significant piece of that is really the direct air pollution reduction. And so reducing things like NO2 in and near roadways. So I think that it's important, if we want to do this kind of cost testing of these subsidies, we need to test the full benefits there. Yeah. And for those that are concerned about the fact that, we find obviously for all new technology adoption, it's higher socioeconomic groups that are maybe benefiting directly from those subsidies in terms of the purchase of EVs. It's the more marginalized socioeconomic groups that actually face the worst of that air pollution, because they are the ones that live typically closer to large roadways where they're more exposed to that. So I think it's important, to kind of take that big picture look. I also wanted to just mention one other, I think, interesting study that gets at David's other points around cost reduction. This was in the case of solar subsidies, but Dr. Thibault in Energy Policy, along with some co-authors, looked at trying to say, what would be the optimal solar subsidy sort of pathway over time based on both the direct emissions reductions and the learning costs. And what they find is that very high subsidies up front to actually drive down the cost of, in this case, solar, but presumably one assumes the same kind of thing applies to EVs, that fall off over time is the right way to do things. And that comes back again then to kind of, well, how do you do that in a fair way? If you have only high subsidies up front and then remove them, of course, you're not leaving those subsidies for others who might be buying EVs later on. And for that, I think we can look to California again and sort of some of what they're doing around having very significant EV subsidies, and then starting to pull those back and having them means tested, right? Once you have a significant level of adoption, then you have those subsidies only for those that are, making below a certain amount of money each year. So very much there are ways to, address the challenges or concerns that people may have, as long as they're, truly legitimate concerns. And then last point before I throw it back to you, Ed, just coming back to this kind of increased polarization, I think that part of it, in my mind, really reflects the degree and level of adoption that we're seeing of EVs, right? And so Dr. Leah Stokes and others have really, I think, documented well how there's increased polarization as technology matures, and it actually starts to become a threat to incumbents within the sector. And I think, we must be seeing some of that within this increased pushback against EVs.
Yes, that's the hint of actually a disinformation campaign. And I want to, before we turn to audience Q&A, just talk about what we're seeing around media coverage of EVs, generally in the context of what we're seeing the debate around climate change and going. And Simon, you'd mentioned it, where we're no longer disputing the science of climate change, but now people are really raising some questions, some invalid, some valid, around particular approaches to addressing climate change. But Simon, back to you. You know, we've had coming up to 9 years of a Liberal government that has done a lot to incentivize EV purchases and manufacturing. And that's, you know, the rebates that we mentioned, provincial governments, some not in our province here in Alberta, but many provinces have their own rebates. We've got a ZEV mandate of 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2035 for all new light duty vehicles. And we have infrastructure investments, which we'll tackle separately. You've had, you know, you're on your latest, greatest Conservative Prime Minister in Rishi Sunak, so it's a nice study in contrast. What has been the UK government's approach?
I'll talk about the UK, but just before I do that, I thought I'd quite like to mention something about this debate about cost effectiveness. So I think, like, stepping back, there's two things that I think are really important to bear in mind. One is just the fact that, you know, cost optimality is great, and, like, you know, modeling of how much things are going to cost and, you know, spending money in the right way is great. But we also have this kind of great imperative to limit dangerous climate change. And we know what we need to do that is cutting emissions dramatically this decade. We know that EVs are going to be like a big part of the solution for road transport. You mentioned the likely crucial line from the IPCC, and they said basically at least half, well, roughly about half of the road transport emissions reductions that we're likely to see on a pathway to 1.5 or 2 degrees is going to be from EVs, even if you take into account like behavior change, you know, urban infrastructure and so on. And so, you know, throwing a little bit of money at EVs to build that market, even if it is maybe not the most, you know, 100% most optimal route, that's probably a legitimate choice. And I think just the other thing, I mean, Sara, you already mentioned this, but it's obviously about fairness and about who benefits. And, you know, that ultimately that's a policy choice. And that, you know, that you mentioned different ways that you can design subsidies. We had subsidies in the UK and we got rid of them, basically because, you know, the Conservative governments tend to be less into that kind of thing. And that basically means that, you know, people on lower incomes can't buy new EVs so easily. And so that, you know, that is a policy decision. It means that they can't access the lower running costs that they would enjoy if they had an EV. They have to wait for, you know, the sticker price to come down, or, you know, perhaps a second-hand market for EVs. So I think those are both important considerations.
To interrupt, could I ask you, with the subsidies, because it's germane to Canada, we've got a Conservative Prime Minister in waiting in Pierre Poilievre, who would very likely yank the subsidy program. What did that yanking that subsidy program do to EV sales in the UK?
You know, sales are increasing worldwide. The number of vehicles, you know, the range of different vehicles that you can buy, that, you know, the prices are coming down, albeit still above, you know, combustion engine equivalents. And so I think, you know, they made a calculation in the UK that, you know, the government decided that they could pull the subsidy without kind of completely crashing the market, and that has been the case. And then since then they have also introduced a ZEV mandate. As you mentioned, Canada has one too, right? And so we're seeing this year is the first year that comes into effect. And where you know, manufacturers had been kind of holding back EV sales towards the back end of last year, basically because they knew they were going to have quotas to fill this year, we're now seeing, like, you know, sales increasing again. So, you know, I think that tends to be the model. It's not just with EVs. We've seen it with, you know, solar and other clean technologies where, you know, initially markets driven by subsidies, you know, they have a bit of a crash, or they kind of slow down a bit when subsidies get pulled. But, you know, with something like the ZEV mandate and with continuing cost reductions, then the market starts picking up again.
Great. David, you want to jump back in? I assume it's on subsidies.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of gently push back a bit. I think Simon is, maybe it's a caricature, but I think sort of overstating the case. So I think you more or less said, Simon, that, well, we know we have to cut very quickly this decade to have a safe climate, and so it's okay to put money in even if it's not cost effective. So of course, first of all, we don't know that. That's not what the science says. That's what advocates say. What the science actually says, except there's some kind of cost benefit estimate, is significantly higher than that. And that argument can be made for all sorts of different things. And I have really a different framing. As we've gone from the beginning of the phony war to the real climate action, where we're now spending this 1.7% globally of GDP on clean energy, actually getting serious about cost effectiveness starts to matter more. We can't just sort of subsidize anything that's expensive. So I think these factors start to matter more. And to quickly pick up on something Sara said, yes, you're absolutely right that we're doing the total cost you need to calculate air pollution impacts of both pathways. And obviously it's the fossil pathway that dominates air pollution. Agreed. Whether or not it's so focused on the disadvantage is not clear. Different studies do it different ways. Remember, almost most PM and ozone is non-local.
Of course, spending money wisely matters, particularly in, current economic climate. That's the challenge that all governments are facing, around the world. Rolling back 10 years, people were having very similar arguments about, high subsidies for solar. And that seemed like a dumb idea to a lot of people because per ton of carbon, it was expensive. But we wouldn't be where we are with the solar industry, the cost reductions that we've seen. If and that was to the point that Sara made, the paper you pointed to. Basically, we wouldn't be where we are now with solar if we hadn't spent a lot of money subsidizing it up front. So obviously you have to look at these things carefully. Maybe upfront subsidies aren't the right way or aren't needed even anymore. But I think with that kind of longer term picture, you can justify spending some upfront. Just on the UK, we had this big debate around whether even to bring in the ZEV mandate. There was some quite strong campaigning from some of the newspapers and from certain car makers behind the scenes were kind of pushing back on the ZEV mandate. It had been brought forward from a sort of a 2035 combustion engine car phase out to 2030 under Boris Johnson, whatever he is, something like 3 or 4 prime ministers ago. It's quite hard to keep track here, but under Rishi Sunak, he basically pushed that back out to 2035, which obviously aligns with places like Canada, but also with the EU. And that was against a backdrop where a lot of people like the Sun newspaper I think was pushing, and the Mail, they were both pushing for that ZEV mandate to be dropped altogether. So we ended up with this slightly messy compromise, but we do now have the ZEV mandate in place.
Sara, do you mind? Can I throw to you? I'd love to just talk about so maybe the ZEV mandate, but let's talk about the Canadian government's multi-billion-dollar bet on investing in EV manufacturing in Canada. And something that also may end were Pierre Poilievre to become prime minister. So just for context, the Canadian government has made this big bet on the EV supply chain. It's invested $44 billion in construction support and subsidies in 3 factories: the Volkswagen battery plant in St. Thomas, Alberta. Alberta, that's Freudian slip, in St. Thomas, Ontario. A Northvolt battery plant in suburban Montreal and Quebec, and the Stellantis plant, and that's the one that's garnered all the media attention in Windsor, Ontario. And the government of Canada claims it's seizing first mover advantages for Canada. We're going to leverage our supply of critical minerals to make us an EV battery, EV assembly powerhouse. Now, on the first movers argument, you could say, well, other jurisdictions have been at this for a lot longer. And China, in fact, has been manufacturing EV batteries for 20 years. And betting this kind, and we all agree about EVs, and the rationale, I guess it's questioning the government of Canada's bet on trying to bring Canada in a serious way to the battery manufacturing and the EV assembly game. What are your thoughts, and maybe relative to the opportunity cost of the capital and labor that's going into that investment versus other parts of industrial decarbonization?
There's a bunch of different things that I think that you could view this policy as trying to do. And it's a question of, how do you divide it between them, or which one do you think is the driving factor? The idea of it as a sort of jobs policy that is in the green job space, but really is much more of a domestic manufacturing support. Is one way, I think, given Canada's history in vehicle manufacturing, is one way to really read this. A separate one is actually more through the lenses of like energy security, right? And I think there is a big push to, have a diversification of the supply chain of electric vehicles as they become a more important part of our transportation sector. And I think there's probably some good logic behind that to say that, if we are, as David said, going to see light duty vehicle manufacturing become predominantly or become electrified, then there's good reasons that you wouldn't want to have that all happening within only one country. And then there is the green kind of element to that of, well, if you're manufacturing more EVs locally, you may be having more sales of them. I think it's interesting to see that it's very similar to what's happening in the US, really, in terms of the IRA supporting electric vehicle and electric battery manufacturing. They are in predominantly red or Republican districts as well too. So I don't know that it's so much of an outlier compared to what the U.S. is doing. If I had any quibble about the way that the government has moved forward with these subsidies, is that they seem to be much more sort of targeted and through bilateral agreements than an approach where you sort of open up the options and say, here are the rules and here's the support that you can get, and you let any company that's ready to come and do that. I think that would be a better way to go about doing this. I'd also like to see more ties and more work on the mining side, which I think is maybe coming to see what we could do to have Alberta be the provider of some of the lithium for those batteries, right? I think it's a little bit underexplored in terms of the production that we might see of critical minerals coming out of Alberta, and kind of that transformation of the experience and expertise that we have in, sort of put crudely, extracting things from underground for transportation. This is another version of that.
Great. And David, to put you on the spot, can you comment more on the U.S. approach under the Inflation Reduction Act that Sara mentioned? Because I know IRA has both rebates or subsidies for purchase, and I think the jury is out on whether those are working or not, and then the same kind of production incentives to actually bring the EV supply chain into the U.S.
My simple and repetitive and boring answer from Canada is, man, Canada needs to focus on a few things that can win on for manufacturing. And so I get worried when they're talking about doing, batteries and assembly and these different pieces and lithium in Alberta. I think each of these things may or may not make sense, but you need to put a lot of effort and industrial policy in if you're really going to win.
Simon, any comment? And you must track it, sort of comparing and contrasting, say, the U.S. approach to the Canadian approach versus the U.K. approach. We don't know what it's doing on EV manufacturing.
I guess two things briefly, if I may. One, just on the UK approach. I mean, the story that you've been talking about in terms of what the Canadian government's doing, it sounds very, very familiar from in terms of what's happening in the UK. There's news just in the last couple of days that that there was going to be like a new gigafactory built near Coventry Airport in the West Midlands. The government's been, putting a lot of, basically handing bungs to big companies to make these kind of investments. Not all of them have worked out. There was this big kind of gigafactory that was going to be called British Volt, that was going to make batteries, and that's basically fallen through. And I think, similar sort of questions as to whether the UK is indeed well placed to kind of capitalize on these opportunities or not. But I think just kind of stepping back from the UK experience specifically, there's just this really interesting geopolitical moment where, China's obviously built up this huge kind of lead in terms of clean technologies more broadly, not just EVs, but, supply chains for solar batteries, EVs, and so on. And they've just been pouring huge amounts of money into this in terms of investing in manufacturing capacity. And, effectively, they've created this massive kind of glut of clean technology supply, which they're now starting to export. And that's just, creating real kind of ripple effects. And that's kind of why you're seeing, like the EU announcing investigations into, Chinese subsidies for EVs, for solar, and so on. You've got President Biden talking about, concerns about floods of Chinese cars. And you can kind of see why they're worried. They're worried about the manufacturing industries for cars in their own countries being, severely damaged by basically really good EVs coming from China very cheaply. And from a climate perspective, that might be quite good. It makes it easier for consumers to buy them. but from a kind of an industrial policy, from jobs and so on, and from just diversity and security of supply, you can see why governments might be wanting to drive some of those domestic investments themselves.
Simon, you're in the media business through Carbon Brief, and it seems like that we're seeing a parallels between the misinformation and perhaps the disinformation on EVs, the parallels versus just climate in general. In terms of, and I had mentioned it earlier, you'd mentioned it, we've gone from those who are often on the other side, on the right side of the political spectrum, who are skeptics and saying the science is wrong, to now, well, okay, it's indisputable, and this is part of the fact of living in a changing climate world, where in the last 10 years it's become abundantly obvious to many people, even when you discount some of it through recency bias, that the climate is changing. In Canada, we've just gone through a record warm winter. But is this EVs, is this a subset of disinformation or misinformation around climate generally?
I think it's pretty clear that we're in this new phase. A lot of the decarbonisation that's happened to date in places like the UK, but many other countries, has kind of taken place a little bit invisibly. It's taken place out of sight and out of mind. So in the UK, it's predominantly we've got rid of coal in the power sector. Coal use for generating electricity has really crashed in many developed countries, and people just they don't necessarily see that. And we're now into this phase where things like people's homes and their cars and things that are very personal, everyday experience, are being targeted. ZEV mandates. We're talking about a clean heat market mechanism in the UK to drive the uptake of heat pumps. And it becomes much more controversial, I guess, because these are things that people are going to feel the effects of very directly in their lives. But I guess the other thing that I would say is that my observation about how these media narratives are running is that they very frequently, as you said, kind of take a kernel of truth. So, sure, EVs have a different experience compared to a petrol car. You do need to charge them more frequently. Or the upfront cost is high, all of these issues that people identify, but they tend to get blown out of proportion. So I mean, you mentioned the Mythbuster we did. There were so many different things, like, oh, EVs catch on fire. No, actually, they're less likely. But they are different, right? And so basically all of these narratives have a little bit of a kernel of truth to them, but then they get blown out of all proportion. And I think that's kind of the theme that I would say, not just for EVs, but for a lot of climate solutions, where a kernel of an issue that needs to be solved, a challenge, whether it's integrating, renewables into the grid, whether it's solving critical mineral shortages or, mining for them. These problems are big. They're big challenges. Tackling climate change is a big problem, but they're not insurmountable. And so they're often painted as if they're sort of insurmountable problems, and as if we can just carry on as we are and ignore the climate crisis. So I think to the extent that EVs are illustrative, that's how I would view things.
The province of Alberta recently imposed a $200 annual levy on electric vehicles. And as you can imagine, the knee-jerk progressive response has been very negative. But its argument is that, EVs aren't paying a fuel tax, and as a result, they have wear and tear on roads, and we need to sort of hit them up elsewhere. Are you seeing that in other jurisdictions now? And do you see that as an anti-EV measure?
We haven't seen something like that in the UK specifically, but we've had quite a similar, I guess it's kind of a sleeper argument. So, fuel duty, i.e. a tax on petrol and diesel that people buy when they fuel their cars, that makes up something like 25 to 30 billion pounds worth of tax revenues for the government every year. Just in context for what that means, that's basically like half the defence budget or like a quarter of the education budget for the government. So it's big money. And obviously, as people transition to EVs, that money is going to disappear. So we haven't really had a proper debate about it, but people are saying, well, how's the government going to solve that? Is it going to be road charging? I don't think people have suggested like a kind of flat tax on EVs. But it's fair enough. EVs are not without externalities. They cause traffic. They do cause wear and tear on the roads. And simply put, governments can't afford not to have that revenues. So whatever the sort of the solution is, whether it is linked to however many miles you drive, you get charged per mile. That, that would be the fairest and most efficient solution. But then that, that has other problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another perfect example of there being a kernel of truth of, we should ensure that there is a fair way of charging EVs. But the approach taken is a very ham-handed one, and one that doesn't seem to even use the data that we have available, right? So one could imagine a registration fee for EVs that looks at, how much they were driven in the previous year and uses that to approximate mileage. Certainly also, as soon as you want to start charging vehicles for sort of the externalities that they have, the size of the vehicle overall, whether it's an EV or not, certainly has a big impact on, what it means for safety of others on the roads and things like that too. So, having something that replaces the fuel tax, I think makes sense. But it needs to be, I think, more, have more of a tie to A, how much people are driving, B, whether or not there's actually the fuel tax in place in Alberta, because we know that if the price of oil goes above $80 a barrel, the government has committed to removing those fuel taxes again. And certainly also, that as long as we have a carbon tax on gasoline, then there's a, justification for saying, well, you have already created internalizing that externality, but were that to be removed again, then there would be a need to consider kind of those differences there.
Great. Okay, now we're going to get to audience questions, and our first questioner is Lyle Triton or Triton. Sorry, I'm not sure the pronunciation of your name. Go ahead, Lyle.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. It's Triton. So I'm in the battery metal space, have been for 30 years working on nickel. But I struggle a little bit with the thesis of replacing an internal combustion engine with an EV, especially here in Alberta. When I run the numbers using Carbon Brief or using Environment Canada numbers, I get different results, but effectively throwing away an ICE car to replace it with an EV, I get equivalencies at 70 to 150,000 kilometers, and I drive about 7,000 or 8,000 kilometers a year now. So I'm looking at a decade or so to make an EV pay off its carbon debt as a replacement vehicle. I get run over tomorrow. The choice is reasonably clear. Just wondering about the thoughts on the analysis of that, and the data sources.
I don't know the specific numbers that you've been using. I mean, obviously, it is the case if you've got an existing combustion engine car and you're thinking about replacing it with a new EV, then there is a significant kind of carbon debt, if you like, relating to the manufacturing of the battery itself and the car. But again, like a combustion engine cars have really significant use phase emissions, might be something like three or 4 or even 5 tons per year. And so if your EV is maybe like 10 tons to manufacture it of CO2, then you can see like that can get paid off relatively quickly. And so I guess it depends on the specific circumstances, how many miles you drive and so on. I mean, I guess the other thing that's it's worth mentioning, like obviously not driving saves a lot more carbon than buying an EV. But for a lot of people, that isn't an option. And so, generally the way I kind of think of it, if you have to have a car, it's probably better if it's an EV. If you're going to replace your car, I mean, you're going to replace the car anyway at some point. Should you replace it early with an EV? I mean, maybe that depends. But when you replace the car, it should be an EV because that will cut carbon significantly.
Add one other thought too on kind of what happens when you sell that internal combustion engine vehicle. And in fact, we do have quite a robust, used vehicle market, and I think that does help the calculation here. Right at the end of the day, that vehicle doesn't, your internal combustion engine vehicle, especially if it's efficient, doesn't end up getting scrapped. In fact, it goes into the used vehicle supply chain. And in the end, you sort of imagine everybody gets a slightly more efficient vehicle, and what ends up getting scrapped is usually the oldest, most inefficient vehicle that somebody would have bought otherwise. So while it's true that sort of and this comes back to David's point about the complexities of life cycle analysis, is where you draw that, where you draw your box when it comes to the analysis that you're doing for yourself directly. It may take that 7 to 10 years, but I think if you look at the system as a whole, it can be a shorter time frame. The other thing, though, is that it does show why some governments are also trying to target high mileage vehicles for electrification, right? And so there is some logic to saying, coming back to that efficient costs, if you want to have a certain group of vehicles that you're really targeting heavily, you would want to look at vehicles that are being driven a lot, whether that's, taxis or other types of vehicles as well, too.
Hey, Simon, in our rapid fire round, we didn't hit upon range. And I see Ed Brost has a comment and a question here, or actually it's a comment, and he says he's been driving an EV for 6 years. You see about 20 to 30% loss in range in cold weather relative to the EPA ratings, but you get much more than what's rated in the summer, and suggests it might be helpful if manufacturers gave winter-summer range so that consumers could better understand the range issue. So a knock here that you often in a cold weather climate like Canada is that, your range drastically decreases more than that 20 to 30%, that you have to warm your battery, that you have to spend electricity just keeping that battery warm. And then some of the actual doomsayers say that, well, your car just won't start when it's cold weather. So, well, in your 21, myth-busting piece, what did you say about range?
We actually didn't really look a great deal at range. I mean, it's clear that the market has shifted dramatically. People kind of might imagine the first kind of generation of kind of mainstream electric vehicles like a Nissan Leaf or something. They used to have a range of like 100 miles or 150 miles. Typically now we're a lot of cars that be more like 250, 300. So sure, you might well lose a lot of range if it's cold, simply because of warming the battery, warming the car. And just because the way batteries work, the chemistry of it is affected by the temperature. But that's not to say that the range is suddenly kind of unusable. And I guess the other point about cold weather and EVs is one of the markets that has one of the highest penetration rates of EVs in the world is Norway, and obviously perhaps not quite as extreme as Canada. I don't know the kind of climate in Norway versus Canada, but it's a pretty cold place, and they seem to get on just fine. Again, it's one of these issues of there's a kernel there. There was reporting recently about they had some problems with a first kind of generation of electric buses in Norway, where they're really struggling to cope with cold weather conditions. But they're like, well, we're not giving up on this. We're just going to work out the problems. And that I think is the same for cold weather.
A question here just about India and what is India doing? We unpacked a bit about China, and those who have been there have seen firsthand what it's doing in terms of electrifying its transport, what it's doing aggressively now in building up its EV manufacturing chain, not just batteries, but actual cars, which we'll see in North America shortly. Open to anyone, and David, I know you're recently in India. What is India doing? I have no idea the degree of electrification that you see there, and if it has any of its own manufacturing supply chain.
You don't see much on the streets when I was there in September in 3 different big cities. Certainly lots of policy people are talking about it. There's talk about really pushing it into these small scooter vehicles, which I think would be a very cost-effective thing to do. Of course, back to the air pollution trade-off, if you're going against diesel vehicles that have very high local pollution, then the benefits of EVs are even larger, and a health benefit really quite huge. Even pretty recently, I saw in India and in Bangladesh when I was there, EVs that were still lead acid battery powered, which kind of stunned me that was still true. I don't really understand the economics of it.
I think people underestimate the extent to which like 2- and 3-wheeler electric vehicles are a really significant part of the story in places like India, but in other countries as well. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, when they kind of do the analysis of how much oil demand is being offset by the EVs that have been deployed already globally. I don't know the exact proportion, but a significant proportion of that is down to 2- and 3-wheelers. And then also like buses, just down to the fact that they do high mileage. And so yeah, I think that maybe surprises people. Somewhere like China, I think, the vast majority of buses there now are electrified, but actually their market as a whole, I think, is getting close to 50% what they call new energy vehicles, which I think involves EVs, but also plug-in hybrids. But that's kind of a staggering penetration rate compared to somewhere like the UK. I think we're about 20%. I don't know about, I think the US is well below 10%. I don't know about Canada, but I think people don't realize quite how far ahead they are.
Yeah, Shanghai is really stunning. Just to kind of push back to you on temperatures, Norway is a coastal climate. It's really not very cold compared to interior North America, so it really is a difference. I think the I don't see it as a long-term challenge, and clearly EVs actually probably start better than conventional vehicles, is my sense, at extreme cold. But the range issue feels to me real in cold temperatures.
Let's make this our last question. We're getting close to the top of the hour, and Peter Falloon here is talking about hydrogen versus as a reasonable alternative to electric for some portion of the transportation system. And, I think of that question, I think of the CEO of Toyota, who has recently said that he thinks that EVs will top out at no more than 30% of the market. That's Toyota chairman, not CEO, Akio Toyoda. What do we think? What is the latest? And by the way, I should say Japan and Toyota have bet fairly big on the hydrogen economy, as has Germany in terms of its investment in hydrogen fueling infrastructure. But we no longer see it as any credible discussion about personal transportation. So I'll open it up to all of you, Simon, David, Sara. What is the role of hydrogen? Where could it be used to help decarbonize transportation?
I'll jump in. This is stuff I put a lot of time into 20 years ago. I think if you think the whole transportation structure and you think, where does hydrogen really make sense? It makes sense in some places where you're substituting for very dirty fuels, where the volumetric constraint that hydrogen is a low density gas doesn't matter that much, and where you're going from major places that actually have hydrogen already there. And one of the answers we thought about very seriously was international shipping. There's some deep reasons why that might make sense. It's also conceivable in aircraft where you get the giant benefit of the weight benefit that really doesn't play out that much anywhere else. I think overall, hydrogen for light duty vehicles feels to me extraordinarily unlikely now, particularly as EVs really come in, that it's so hard to build out a light duty refueling infrastructure. And now it's going to be even harder as gasoline goes down and EVs come up. You'd have to get to a point where you had enough hydrogen infrastructure, and local hydrogen is pretty cost and environmentally inefficient. So I just don't see a version of that for light duty vehicles. I do think it might happen elsewhere in the transportation system. Heavy off-road vehicles as well for mining, for example.
I'm with you, David. I mean, I think one of the parts, and I'll just point to this specific one, is the infrastructure, right? And as we talked about, we hear so much about how it's going to be so hard to build out an EV charging infrastructure, despite the fact that we already have the fuel, if you want, the electricity running all over our, countries and wherever we're going. And so, imagine doing that for a fuel that you don't have sort of currently circulating.
Agree with all of that, and just to put some numbers on this, I think as of last year there were less than 100,000 fuel cell electric vehicles on the road, i.e. hydrogen fueled vehicles, and I think we're up to sort of 15 or 20 million EVs. So just in terms of what's actually happening, I mean, Toyota historically has made a big push and a big bet on hydrogen vehicles, but I just don't see it happening. And I think the kind of the space where it might make sense is shrinking all the time, as in terms of like heavy duty trucks, even seeing big moves into electrification there. So I think it may be a niche solution in some places, but yeah, in general I agree completely with what Sara and David said.
Yeah, and one of those niche areas, Simon, is we may see it actually on the rails here as part of rolling stock. And a railway company, Canadian Pacific, is committed to piloting hydrogen engines to replace diesel engines. But we are now over the top of the hour, so let's leave it at that. Simon, thank you very much for joining us. It's later in the day, your time. We're grateful for your time and your insight. Closing comments. This episode's going to be available at energyversusclimate.com. And through your usual podcasters, wherever you listen, please review and rate us when you can. It helps new listeners to find the show. Thanks to Crystal Hickey, Serena Gibson, Tally Grunauer, and our producer Emma Tandon for their support. We're going to be back next month, time TBD, with commentary on the consumer carbon tax, which lately has every progressive politician running for the exits, save for our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It's been of much debate of late, so we'll comment on it. See you then, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.